The morning of March 17th, 1944, 23,000 feet above Brunswick, Germany, Hauptmann Heinz Knoke squeezed his control stick, his Focke-Wulf 190 rolling inverted as he dove toward the formation of Boeing B-17 flying fortresses crawling across the winter sky below. At 26 years old, Knoke had already shot down 31 Allied aircraft. He was an experienced hunter, a product of the Luftwaffe's rigorous training system, and he approached this mission with the confidence that came from 2 years of successful combat. The bomber formation stretched across 10 miles of sky, over 200 heavy bombers flying in their characteristic combat boxes, each aircraft bristling with 50 caliber machine guns. But Knoke wasn't concerned about the bombers. His attention fixed on the escort fighters weaving above the formation, small silver cruciform shapes that glinted in the weak March sunlight. American P-51 Mustangs. Knoke had encountered them twice before in recent weeks. His assessment had been consistent with reports from other German pilots. Fast in level flight, excellent range, but fundamentally weak. The Mustang's thin wings and light construction made it vulnerable to the devastating firepower of German cannon. Its 650 caliber machine guns, while numerous, lacked the punch of 20mm or 30mm shells that could destroy heavy bombers with single bursts. Most importantly, the Mustang seemed fragile compared to the rugged Focke-Wulf 190 that Knoke flew. His aircraft could absorb punishment from defensive fire, press home attacks through fields of tracers, and return to base with battle damage that would have destroyed lighter fighters. The Americans had built a racing aircraft with guns, elegant and fast, but unsuited for the brutal reality of combat over the Reich. Knoke initiated his attack run, diving through the escort screen toward the lead bomber element. The tactical situation seemed routine, almost mechanical. Destroy 2 or 3 bombers, climb away before the escorts could respond, return to base to rearm and repeat the process. The mathematics of attrition favored the defenders. Every bomber destroyed weakened the American campaign. Every mission survived added to his victory total. Then everything changed. The Mustang that had been orbiting 3,000 feet above the bomber formation rolled inverted and dove after him. Knoke instinctively began his standard evasion, a hard rolling break that would force the pursuing fighter into a tail chase, where the Focke-Wulf's superior dive performance would create separation. But the American pilot didn't follow the expected script. Instead of turning to follow Knoke's break, the Mustang continued straight down, cutting the angle, closing the distance with shocking speed. Knoke glanced back through his canopy, calculating intercept geometry with the practiced eye of an experienced pilot. The American was positioning for a deflection shot, leading his target rather than chasing. It was aggressive flying, the kind that required confidence in both aircraft and gunnery. The Mustang's guns opened fire at 400 yards. Knoke could see the muzzle flashes, 8 simultaneous points of light along the American fighter's wings and nose. At that range, most pilots would have held fire, conserving ammunition for closer engagement where hits were more certain. But the American was firing long bursts, walking his tracers toward Knoke's aircraft with methodical precision. The first rounds cracked past Knoke's canopy, close enough to make him flinch. Then the strikes began. Not the heavy, catastrophic impacts of 20mm cannon shells, but a sustained hammering that tore through his aircraft's structure with relentless efficiency. Pieces of aluminum skin peeled away from his left wing. His windscreen starred with cracks as 50 caliber rounds punched through. The armored glass. The entire airframe shuddered under impacts that came too fast to count. Knoke's instrument panel exploded in a shower of sparks and broken glass. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across his legs. The control stick jerked in his hands as something severed in the control linkage. He attempted to level his wings, but the Focke-Wulf responded sluggishly, one aileron damaged or destroyed by the continuing fire. The American was still shooting. Knoke could hear the impacts over his engine noise, a continuous tearing sound that seemed impossible. How much ammunition did the Mustang carry? How could those rifle-caliber machine guns be doing this much damage? His aircraft was supposed to be tough, designed to absorb punishment from defensive fire. But whatever was hitting him wasn't stopping. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Missing cylinders as coolant poured from ruptured lines. White smoke streamed behind his aircraft, visible for miles against the grey winter sky. The BMW 801 radial that had seemed so reliable minutes earlier was tearing itself apart. He pulled the throttle to idle, reducing power before catastrophic mechanical failure could turn the engine into a fireball. The Mustang pulled alongside, close enough for Knoke to see the American pilot's face behind the bubble canopy. The man looked young, probably no older than Knoke himself, with the focused intensity that came from combat flying. The American rocked his wings once, a gesture that could have been salute or warning, then banked away to rejoin his formation. Knoke was alone, 30 miles deep in German airspace, flying a crippled fighter that was losing altitude at 500 feet per minute. His entire understanding of American capabilities, built through months of combat experience and intelligence briefings, had just been shattered by 3 seconds of sustained fire from weapons he had dismissed as inadequate. The Mustang's 850 caliber machine guns hadn't just damaged his aircraft, they had systematically destroyed it with precision that seemed impossible at 400 yards range, and the American pilot had done it with apparent ease, as if this kind of long-range gunnery was routine rather than exceptional. As Knoke nursed his dying fighter toward the nearest emergency landing field, bleeding hydraulic fluid and trailing smoke, a disturbing question formed in his mind. If the Americans had built fighters this effective, armed them this heavily, and trained pilots who could shoot this accurately, what else had German intelligence gotten wrong about Allied capabilities? The answer to that question would fundamentally alter the Luftwaffe's understanding of the air war over Europe. But discovering it would cost hundreds of German pilots their lives and dozens of fighter wings their effectiveness. The P-51 Mustang, dismissed as weak and unsuitable for serious combat, was about to prove itself as perhaps the most lethal fighter aircraft of the entire war, and German pilots, trained on doctrines that emphasized cannon firepower over sustained accuracy, were completely unprepared for what was coming. The story of how the Luftwaffe's contempt for the Mustang transformed into grudging respect, then genuine fear, reveals not just the evolution of one aircraft, but the collision of 2 fundamentally different approaches to aerial warfare. The Germans had built their tactics around devastating single strikes. The Americans had built a system around sustained, accurate fire that could destroy anything within range. The question wasn't which approach was theoretically superior. The question was which approach would prove more effective in the brutal mathematics of industrial warfare, where pilot survival and consistent results mattered more than individual tactical brilliance. Knoke would survive to fly again, returning to combat after 2 weeks of recovery. But the confidence he had carried into that March morning was gone, replaced by the cold knowledge that German fighter pilots faced an opponent more dangerous than any they had encountered before. The weak American fighter, with its rifle-caliber guns, had nearly killed him at ranges where his cannon couldn't even reach the target. And intelligence reports suggested that thousands more Mustangs were entering service, each carrying the same devastating battery of 8 synchronized machine guns, each piloted by Americans trained to exploit advantages that German tactical doctrine couldn't counter. The transformation in Luftwaffe perception didn't happen overnight. It required repeated encounters, mounting casualties, and systematic intelligence analysis before German commanders acknowledged what their pilots were experiencing in combat. But once that acknowledgement came, it forced a complete reassessment of American aerial capabilities and the tactical doctrines designed to counter them. To understand why the Luftwaffe initially dismissed the P-51 Mustang, one must first understand the doctrinal framework that shaped German fighter tactics from the war's earliest days. The Luftwaffe's approach to aerial combat had been forged in the crucible of the Spanish Civil War, refined during the Battle of Britain, and perfected through 3 years of combat on the eastern and western fronts. German fighter doctrine emphasized the principle of overwhelming firepower delivered in brief, decisive engagements. The standard armament for Luftwaffe fighters reflected this philosophy, The Messerschmitt Bf-109G carried 130mm Mk-108 cannon firing through the propeller hub, plus two 13mm MG-131 machine guns synchronized above the engine. Some variants added two additional 20mm MG-151 cannons in underwing gondolas, sacrificing performance for even greater striking power. The Focke-Wulf 190, entering service in 1941, took this approach even further. The A-series variants mounted four 20mm Oerlikon cannons in the wing roots, while later models added two 13mm machine guns for a total of 6 weapons. The firepower was devastating. A single 1-second burst from an FW-198 delivered approximately 6.8 kilograms of explosive projectiles onto the target. By comparison, a Spitfire Mark IX's two 20mm cannons and four 7.7mm machine guns delivered only 3.1 kilograms in the same time frame. German pilots were trained to exploit this firepower advantage through specific tactical methods. The standard attack profile involved approaching bomber formations from advantageous positions, usually from above and behind, or in head-on passes that minimized exposure to defensive fire. The pilot would close to ranges between 100 and 200 meters, roughly 300 to 600 feet, then fire a concentrated burst lasting 1 to 2 seconds. At these close ranges, even brief engagement windows were sufficient. Cannon shells, particularly the 30mm Menengeschoss rounds developed specifically for aircraft destruction, carried enough explosive power to catastrophically damage heavy bombers with just a few hits. A single 30mm round striking a bomber's wing spar could sever control cables, rupture fuel tanks, or destroy structural members critical to flight integrity. This doctrine had proven extraordinarily effective against British and Soviet aircraft. RAF bombers, even the heavily armoured Short Stirlings and Handley Page Halifaxes, could be destroyed with brief cannon bursts. Soviet fighters like the Yak-1 or La-GG-3, while manoeuvrable, were lightly built and vulnerable to even 13mm fire. German pilots developed well-earned confidence in their weapons and tactics. The emphasis on cannon firepower shaped more than just aircraft armament. It influenced pilot training, tactical doctrine, and even strategic planning for fighter production. Luftwaffe pilots learned to maneuver for position, to wait for optimal firing opportunities, and to deliver single devastating strikes rather than sustained fire. This approach conserved ammunition, a critical consideration given that cannon carried far fewer rounds than machine guns. A typical Focke-Wulf 190A8 carried only 250 rounds per cannon, enough for approximately 12 seconds of sustained fire. By contrast, machine guns might carry 1,000 rounds or more. German pilots learned to make every cannon shell count, firing only when impact was virtually certain. The training regimen reflected these priorities. New Luftwaffe pilots spent weeks at gunnery ranges, learning to judge range accurately, to lead moving targets precisely, and to fire in brief, controlled bursts. The best pilots could estimate range to within 10 meters by eye alone, a skill developed through thousands of practice engagements. This training produced exceptional marksmen who could destroy targets with minimal ammunition expenditure. Intelligence assessments of Allied aircraft reinforced these doctrinal assumptions. British fighters like the Hurricane and early Spitfire marks mounted primarily rifle-caliber machine guns, weapons that German pilots knew from experience required sustained fire to achieve kills. Even when the British upgraded to cannon-armed Spitfires, they typically mounted only two 20mm weapons, supplemented by machine guns, giving them less throw weight than comparable German fighters. Soviet aircraft, captured and evaluated at test facilities like Rechlin, showed vulnerability to German cannon that validated the Luftwaffe's emphasis on heavy armament. When intelligence reports began, describing a new American long-range escort fighter in late 1943, German analysts applied their existing framework for understanding fighter effectiveness. The North American P-51 Mustang, designated by German intelligence as the Mustang Mark III to distinguish it from earlier Allison-engined variants, carried 650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns later increased to 8 in some variants. The German analysis focused on this armament choice as evidence of design weakness. 50 caliber ammunition, while larger than the rifle caliber 7.7mm rounds used by early British fighters, still lacked the explosive power of cannon shells. A 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary round weighed approximately 43 grams. A 20mm cannon shell weighed 120 grams, nearly 3 times as much, and carried a far larger explosive charge. Luftwaffe technical intelligence calculated that the Mustang's 6 machine guns, even firing simultaneously, delivered less total projectile weight per second than a single Mk-108 30mm cannon. The conclusion seemed obvious. The Americans had prioritized ammunition capacity and sustained fire over hitting power. This made the Mustang effective against ground targets or lightly built aircraft, but fundamentally unsuitable for the kind of decisive engagement that characterized combat over Germany. Tactical intelligence from early encounters seemed to confirm this assessment. The first Mustang combat missions over Germany occurred in December 1943, escorting heavy bomber formations to targets near Kiel and Osnabrück. Luftwaffe pilots engaging these new escorts reported that they were fast, particularly in level flight and shallow dives, with excellent range that allowed them to accompany bombers deep into German airspace. But the initial combat reports also noted that Mustangs seemed reluctant to engage in turning combat, preferring to maintain speed and position rather than dogfighting with German interceptors. This tactical caution was interpreted as evidence that American pilots lacked confidence in their aircraft's combat capability. German fighter commanders concluded that the Mustang was fundamentally a defensive fighter, capable of protecting bombers through its presence and speed, but unable to aggressively engage German fighters in the kind of violent maneuvering combat that characterized the air war over Europe. This assessment contained a fatal misunderstanding that would cost the Luftwaffe dearly. The Mustang pilots weren't avoiding turning combat because their aircraft couldn't compete. They were following tactical doctrine specifically designed to exploit advantages that German intelligence hadn't recognized. The Americans had developed an entirely different approach to fighter combat, one that prioritized sustained accuracy over individual striking power, and their pilots were trained to methodical perfection in its application. But in early 1944, as Mustang numbers grew and more German pilots encountered them, the prevailing wisdom within the Luftwaffe remained consistent. The Americans had built a fast, long-range aircraft unsuited for serious fighter-versus-fighter combat. Its machine gun armament, while adequate for ground attack or harassing bombers, lacked the destructive power necessary to decisively defeat properly armored German fighters. This conviction would persist until accumulated combat experience forced a brutal reassessment. The process would require months of increasing casualties, hundreds of combat reports describing encounters that didn't match expectations, and systematic analysis that revealed uncomfortable truths about American capabilities. The transformation in German perception, from contempt to respect to fear, would parallel the Luftwaffe's declining effectiveness over the Reich. But in March 1944, as Hauptmann Heinz Knoke struggled to land his battle-damaged Focke-Wulf at an emergency field near Celle, most German pilots still believed their cannon-armed fighters were superior to anything the Americans could field. The systematic destruction of that belief would require American pilots to prove, through sustained combat effectiveness, that their approach to aerial warfare was not just different from German doctrine, but fundamentally more lethal in the specific conditions of the strategic bombing campaign. The superiority of the P-51 Mustang's armament didn't originate in the firepower of individual weapons, but in the systematic integration of technology, training, and tactical doctrine that the United States Army Air Forces had been developing since 1941. While German pilots trained to deliver devastating single strikes with cannon, American pilots learned a fundamentally different approach to aerial gunnery that would prove devastatingly effective in the specific conditions of combat over Europe. The Browning M250 caliber machine gun represented the culmination of decades of American small arms development. Designed by John Moses Browning in 1918 and refined throughout the 1920s and 30s, the M2 achieved a combination of reliability, sustained fire capability, and hitting power that no other aircraft weapon could match. Each gun weighed 64 pounds without ammunition, significantly lighter than comparable cannon, and fired at approximately 850 rounds per minute. The critical advantage wasn't rate of fire or individual projectile weight, but sustained accuracy over extended engagement periods. The M2's recoil-operated mechanism provided exceptional stability during firing. Unlike cannon, which generated significant recoil impulses that disrupted aim, the .50 caliber's lower recoil allowed pilots to walk their fire onto targets with minimal correction. This characteristic proved decisive in long-range gunnery, where sustained accuracy mattered more than individual shell power. American ordnance engineers had developed multiple ammunition types, optimized for different tactical situations. The standard combat load mixed armor-piercing incendiary rounds, which could penetrate aircraft armor and ignite fuel, with ball ammunition for structural damage and tracer rounds for aiming reference. This mixture, typically loaded in ratios of 4 API to 1 tracer, created devastating effects on target. The armor-piercing incendiary round carried a hardened steel core capable of penetrating 12.7 mm of armor at 500 yards, sufficient to defeat the face-hardened steel, protecting German cockpits and fuel systems. Upon penetration, a small incendiary charge would ignite, starting fires in fuel systems, hydraulic lines, or oxygen equipment. The cumulative effect of multiple hits created cascading damage that could destroy aircraft even without the catastrophic single-hit kills that German cannon achieved. But the true revolution in American fighter effectiveness came not from the weapons themselves, but from the fire control systems and training methods that made long-range precision possible. The P-51 featured a gyroscopic K-14 computing gun sight, a technology that transformed aerial gunnery from instinctive art into systematic science. The K-14 sight used a gyroscopically stabilized reticle that automatically calculated lead angles based on target range and angular velocity. The pilot would frame the target in the sight's ranging circle, adjust for wingspan using a selector dial calibrated for common German aircraft types, then track the target while the sight's mechanisms computed the necessary lead. When the illuminated pipper aligned with the target, the pilot fired, and the computing sight ensured that his bullets would intersect the target's flight path. This technology didn't eliminate the need for pilot skill, but it dramatically reduced the training time required to produce effective marksmen. Traditional deflection shooting required pilots to instinctively calculate complex three-dimensional trigonometry while maneuvering at 400 miles per hour under combat stress. The computing sight handled these calculations mechanically, allowing pilots to focus on aircraft control and tactical positioning. American training doctrine exploited this technological advantage through systematic gunnery instruction that emphasized volume of accurate fire over precise single-shot marksmanship. At bases throughout the United States, fighter pilots underwent weeks of dedicated gunnery training that would have seemed excessive by German standards. They fired at ground targets, at towed aerial sleeves, and in simulated combat against other fighters, accumulating hundreds of practice engagements before deploying to combat theaters. The training emphasized specific techniques that maximized the .50 caliber system's advantages. Pilots learned to open fire at ranges between 400 and 600 yards, distances where German pilots would never waste cannon ammunition. At these ranges, the .50 caliber's flat trajectory and high velocity made hits probable if the computing sight was used correctly. More importantly, the volume of fire from 6 or 8 guns created a cone of projectiles dense enough that even imperfect aim would score hits. Instructors taught students to fire in bursts lasting 2 to 3 seconds, far longer than the brief cannon bursts German pilots employed. With each gun firing at 850 rounds per minute, a 3-second burst from 8 guns put approximately 340 rounds into the air. This volume of fire didn't just damage targets, it saturated defensive positions and overwhelmed the structural integrity of aircraft, designed to withstand individual cannon hits but not sustained machine gun fire. The ammunition capacity of American fighters supported this doctrine. A P-51D model carried 400 rounds per gun for the inboard weapons and 270 rounds for the outboard positions, totaling 2,740 rounds. At standard firing rates, this provided approximately 32 seconds of sustained fire, more than sufficient for multiple engagements in a single mission. By contrast, a Focke-Wulf 190A8 carried 1,000 rounds total across all 6 weapons, providing only 12 seconds of fire. German pilots had to carefully manage their limited ammunition, waiting for optimal firing opportunities and avoiding long-range shots that would waste precious shells. American pilots could afford to open fire early, to sustain fire through evasive maneuvers, and to continue shooting until the target was destroyed or they broke off the engagement. The tactical implications were profound. German fighters optimized for brief, decisive strikes found themselves facing opponents who could engage from beyond cannon range, sustain fire through defensive maneuvers, and systematically destroy targets through accumulated damage rather than catastrophic single hits. The American approach wasn't more elegant or theoretically superior, but it was devastatingly effective in the specific tactical environment of bomber escort missions over Germany. Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 361st Fighter Group exemplified this new American approach to aerial combat. Drew had graduated from gunnery school at Matagorda, Texas, where he had fired over 15,000 practice rounds in training, more ammunition than most German pilots would expend in their entire combat careers. His instructors had drilled into him the fundamental principle of American fighter doctrine: sustained, accurate fire defeats everything. On October 7, 1944, Drew's squadron encountered a formation of Messerschmitt Me-2 62 jets near Osnabrück, the revolutionary aircraft that represented Germany's last hope for technological supremacy in the air war. The Me-2 62 was substantially faster than any Allied fighter, capable of over 540 miles per hour compared to the Mustang's 440. German propaganda claimed it was invulnerable to conventional fighters, able to attack and escape before Allied pilots could respond. Drew spotted 2 Me-2 62s preparing to attack his bomber formation. Rather than attempting to outrun the jets, impossible given their speed advantage, he positioned himself along their likely attack vector. When the lead jet committed to its run, Drew turned toward it, forcing a head-on engagement where relative closing speed exceeded 800 miles per hour. He opened fire at 800 yards, an absurd range by German standards, far beyond the effective distance of any cannon. His 850 caliber guns created a stream of tracers that reached out across the sky, like a physical connection between his aircraft and the target. The computing site compensated for the extreme deflection angle, walking his fire into the jet's flight path. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Me-2 62 flew directly into Drew's fire stream. At 800 yards, individual rounds lacked the kinetic energy to cause catastrophic damage. But Drew wasn't firing individual rounds. He was firing a continuous stream of 340 projectiles over 4 seconds. And even at extreme range, the cumulative effect was devastating. 50 caliber rounds punched through the jet's thin aluminum skin, shredding control cables, puncturing fuel lines, and damaging the delicate turbine engines that powered the revolutionary aircraft. Drew tracked the jet through his gun sight, maintaining fire as the range closed to 600 yards, then 400. By the time he ceased fire, his guns had put over 200 rounds into the target. The Me-2 62's right engine exploded in flames. The pilot, probably Lieutenant Gerhard Kolbert of Kommando Nowotny, attempted to shut down the damaged engine and limp home on the remaining turbine. But accumulated damage from Drew's sustained fire had severed too many critical systems. The jet rolled inverted and dove toward the ground, its pilot ejecting at low altitude. Drew's wingman, Lieutenant Robert McCandless, destroyed the second Me-2 62 using identical tactics. 2 of Germany's most advanced fighters, aircraft that should have been invulnerable to conventional weapons, had been destroyed by machine gun fire at ranges where German cannon couldn't even reach the target. The engagement lasted less than 30 seconds, but it demonstrated everything that made the American gunnery system superior to German doctrine. The technological advantage of computing gun sights, the tactical advantage of sustained fire capability, and the training advantage of pilots who had fired thousands of practice rounds combined to create effectiveness that transcended individual weapon performance. German intelligence officers analyzing the engagement were forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. The Americans hadn't just built different fighters, they had developed a completely different approach to aerial combat, and that approach was systematically more effective than German doctrine in the specific conditions of the strategic bombing campaign. The turning point, systematic destruction, through accumulated evidence. The transformation in Luftwaffe perception didn't occur through a single dramatic engagement, but through the accumulation of hundreds of combat reports that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of American capabilities. Throughout the spring and summer of 1944, German fighter units filed after-action reports describing encounters with P-51 Mustangs that consistently violated expectations. Pilots reported being hit at ranges they considered impossible for machine gun fire. They described watching Mustangs sustain fire for periods far longer than German ammunition supplies would allow. Most disturbing, they documented systematic destruction of German fighters through accumulated damage rather than catastrophic single hits, a pattern that German tactical doctrine had no framework for understanding. Major Heinz Bahr, third highest-scoring German ace with 220 victories across all fronts, filed one of the most detailed analyses after engaging Mustangs over Berlin on May 8, 1944. Bahr had approached a formation of bombers from above, positioning for the standard diving attack that had proven effective against previous escort fighters. He selected a straggling bomber, rolled inverted, and dove toward his target. A Mustang that had been orbiting several thousand feet above the formation immediately turned toward him. Bahr, confident in his Focke-Wulf's dive performance, continued his attack, expecting to complete his firing pass and extend away before the American could close to effective range. He opened fire at 200 meters, his cannon shells striking the bomber's wing and fuselage. Pieces flew off the Boeing, and one engine began trailing smoke. Then the Mustang opened fire. Bahr was still over 600 meters from the American fighter, well beyond the range where he would even consider wasting cannon ammunition. But he could see muzzle flashes along the Mustang's wings, and seconds later heard the distinctive crack of 50 caliber rounds passing close to his cockpit. Bahr broke off his attack, sacrificing his kill to avoid the incoming fire. The Mustang followed, maintaining pressure, continuing to fire in long bursts that seemed profligate with ammunition. Bahr attempted his standard evasion, a hard diving turn that should have created separation through superior energy retention. But the Mustang stayed with him, pilot maintaining accurate fire through maneuvers that should have disrupted his aim. Rounds began striking Bahr's aircraft, not the heavy, catastrophic impacts of cannon shells, but a persistent hammering that tore through his airframe with relentless efficiency. His port aileron was shredded by multiple hits. Hydraulic pressure dropped as lines were severed. The engine began running rough as cooling system damage caused temperature spikes. Bahr managed to level his wings and extend away using his remaining speed advantage, but his aircraft had absorbed damage that would require days of repair. He had survived, but the encounter fundamentally changed his understanding of American capabilities. In his combat report, preserved in Luftwaffe archives captured after the war, Bahr wrote with uncharacteristic concern, "The American Mustang pilot engaged at ranges I considered impossible for effective fire. He sustained continuous fire for at least 10 seconds, far longer than our cannon ammunition would permit. His accuracy at extreme range suggests either exceptional pilot skill or superior gun-sighting equipment, probably both. Most concerning, his machine gun fire caused accumulated damage equivalent to several cannon hits. We must revise our assessment of American fighter effectiveness." Bahr's report joined dozens of similar accounts from experienced pilots across multiple fighter wings. The pattern was consistent. Mustangs engaged at ranges beyond German cannon effectiveness, sustained fire through evasive maneuvers, and destroyed aircraft through accumulated damage that overcame structural strength through sheer volume of hits. German pilots who survived these encounters reported psychological impacts that went beyond simple combat stress. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, commander of Jagdgeschwader 7 and a 176 Victory Ace, described the effect in his post-war memoir, The Straits of Messina. We had trained our entire careers on the principle that fighters engaged at close range with devastating firepower. The Americans violated this principle systematically. They would fire from distances where we couldn't effectively return fire. They would continue firing through our evasive maneuvers. They would follow us through dives and turns, maintaining that terrible sustained fire that eventually destroyed everything it touched. The psychological effect was devastating. German pilots began avoiding combat with Mustangs, disengaging early, refusing to press attacks even when positioned advantageously. They knew that engaging meant exposing themselves to sustained fire from weapons that, while individually less powerful than our cannon, collectively delivered destruction we couldn't counter. The intelligence officers at Luftwaffe High Command initially resisted these assessments. The implications were too disturbing. If American machine guns were effectively equivalent to German cannon through superior fire control and ammunition capacity, then the entire doctrinal framework that had guided Luftwaffe fighter development since 1936 was fundamentally flawed. German industrial capacity couldn't match American production of fighters. The only apparent German advantage was technological and tactical superiority. If that advantage was illusory, if the Americans had simply developed different but equally effective approaches to the same problems, then the strategic situation was far more desperate than official assessments acknowledged. But by mid-1944, the statistical evidence became impossible to ignore. German fighter losses were accelerating dramatically. In January 1944, the Luftwaffe had lost approximately 240 fighters on the Western Front. By July, monthly losses exceeded 1,000 aircraft. Pilot casualties followed similar trajectories. Experienced pilots, the veterans who formed the core of German fighter effectiveness, were being killed at rates that training programs couldn't replace. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, commander of German fighter forces, ordered a comprehensive analysis of combat loss patterns. The resulting report, compiled from thousands of individual encounter reports and damage assessments, revealed disturbing trends. German fighters were being destroyed increasingly at long range, before pilots could close to effective cannon distance. Accumulated damage from sustained machine gun fire was causing more losses than catastrophic single hits from cannon or anti-aircraft fire. Most significantly, the P-51 Mustang was achieving kill ratios against German fighters that exceeded even the feared P-47 Thunderbolt. In encounters where both aircraft types were present, Mustangs accounted for approximately 60% of German losses, despite representing only 40% of the fighter force. The Americans had created an aircraft specifically optimized for the strategic bombing campaign's requirements, and German tactical doctrine had no effective counter. Galland's analysis prompted desperate tactical revisions. Fighter wings received new engagement protocols emphasizing avoiding prolonged combat with Mustang escorts, focusing attacks exclusively on bombers, and disengaging immediately if Mustangs achieved firing position. These directives represented tacit admission that German pilots could no longer expect to defeat American escorts through superior tactics or firepower. The psychological impact on German pilot morale was profound and measurable. Luftwaffe personnel offices documented increasing rates of medical groundings for stress-related conditions. Pilots reported psychological symptoms consistent with what modern medicine would recognize as combat stress reaction: difficulty sleeping, hypervigilance, intrusive memories of combat encounters, and reluctance to engage enemy fighters, even when tactical situations seemed advantageous. Hauptmann Johannes Wiese, commander of the 1st Staffel of Jagdgeschwader 7, described the morale crisis in a letter to his wife, later captured and translated by American intelligence. "Our pilots no longer believe we can win. They see the American formations, hundreds of bombers protected by fighters that we cannot effectively counter. We attack, and the Mustangs come down on us with that terrible sustained fire. Good pilots, men who have survived dozens of missions, are being killed by weapons we were told were inadequate. The Americans shoot from distances we consider impossible. They fire continuously while we must conserve every shell. Their bullets tear our aircraft apart through accumulated damage that our armor cannot stop. We can still kill them, but the mathematics have turned against us. They produce 10 fighters for every one we build. They train 10 pilots for every one we lose. And their pilots, flying inferior aircraft by our standards, are destroying us systematically. The summer of 1944 brought the crisis to its peak. Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy, stretched German fighter resources across multiple fronts. The Luftwaffe attempted to contest Allied air superiority over the beachheads, throwing fighter wings against the overwhelming numbers of Allied aircraft supporting the ground offensive. The results were catastrophic. In June 1944 alone, the Luftwaffe lost over 1,000 fighters on the Western Front. Of these, approximately 400 were destroyed in air-to-air combat with American fighters, with Mustangs accounting for nearly 60% of these victories. The kill ratio approached 4-1 in favor of American fighters. German pilots were being systematically destroyed by opponents they had dismissed as weak just months earlier. The tactical revolution that American gunnery doctrine represented became clear through specific engagements that demonstrated the Mustang's lethal effectiveness under conditions where German fighters should have held advantages. On June 24, 1944, a formation of 32 Focke-Wulf 190s from Jagdgeschwader 26 intercepted Boeing B-17 bombers near Magdeburg. The German fighters, led by Hauptmann Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, brother of the Luftwaffe fighter commander, attacked from optimal positions with altitude and sun advantage. 16 P-51 Mustangs from the 352nd Fighter Group, led by Major George Preddy, engaged the German formation as it committed to its bombing run. What followed demonstrated everything that made American fighter tactics superior to German doctrine. Rather than dogfighting with the Focke-Wulfs, which would have neutralized the Mustang's advantages, the American pilots maintained speed and altitude advantage, making slashing attacks that utilized their superior long-range gunnery. Preddy selected the lead German fighter, establishing firing position at 400 yards directly astern. He opened fire with all 8 guns, walking his tracers into the target with the methodical precision that characterized American gunnery training. The Focke-Wulf immediately began shedding pieces, its tail structure disintegrating under sustained 50 caliber fire. Within 3 seconds, enough critical systems had been destroyed that the German pilot bailed out, his aircraft entering an uncontrollable spin. Preddy's wingmen engaged similarly, establishing firing positions beyond German cannon range and destroying targets through sustained, accurate fire. The engagement lasted less than 5 minutes. When it ended, 11 German fighters had been destroyed with no American losses. The survivors scattered, abandoning their attack on the bombers without scoring significant kills. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland's combat report, one of his last before being killed in combat weeks later, captured the frustration. We had every tactical advantage. We had position, altitude, and numerical parity. We executed our attack according to doctrine, but the Americans engaged before we could close to effective range. Their machine gun fire at 400 meters was as effective as our cannon at 200. By the time we could return fire, half our formation was destroyed or damaged. We broke off the attack, having accomplished nothing. This pattern repeated across hundreds of engagements throughout the summer of 1944. German fighters, optimized for brief, devastating strikes, found themselves outranged and outgunned by American fighters that could begin killing at distances where German cannon were ineffective. The accumulated effect transformed the air war over Europe from a contest of tactical skill to a mathematical exercise in attrition that Germany could not win. By autumn 1944, the Luftwaffe's fighter force existed in a state of perpetual crisis that no amount of tactical adjustment could resolve. The strategic bombing campaign had evolved into a systematic destruction of German industrial capacity, and the fighter wings tasked with stopping it were being ground down through attrition that rendered individual pilot skill increasingly irrelevant. The Americans had created a system of aerial warfare that overwhelmed German advantages through superior numbers, sustainable logistics, and methodical application of firepower that German doctrine couldn't counter. The statistical evidence painted a picture of accelerating collapse. In January 1944, the Luftwaffe had fielded approximately 1,700 day fighters on the Western Front, with pilot strength at roughly 80% of authorized levels. By October, despite desperate production efforts that actually increased fighter output, operational strength had fallen to approximately 1,200 aircraft, with pilot strength below 60% of requirements. The mathematics were unforgiving. Germany was losing experienced pilots faster than training programs could replace them, while American fighter strength grew monthly. The P-51 Mustang's role in this collapse cannot be overstated. By late 1944, Mustangs equipped 15 fighter groups in the 8th Air Force alone, with additional groups in the 9th Air Force and 15th Air Force in Italy. Over 2,000 Mustangs were operational in the European theatre, providing escort coverage that reached every target within Germany. No bomber formation flew unprotected. No German fighter attack occurred without American fighters engaging from positions of advantage. Major George Preddy of the 352nd Fighter Group became the embodiment of American fighter effectiveness in this period. Between August and December 1944, Preddy would destroy 23 German aircraft in aerial combat, making him the highest-scoring Mustang pilot in the European theatre. His success didn't derive from exceptional natural talent or reckless aggression, but from systematic application of American gunnery doctrine that exploited every advantage the .50 caliber system provided. Preddy's typical engagement followed patterns that would have seemed wasteful by German standards. He would establish firing position at ranges between 400 and 600 yards, distances where German pilots wouldn't consider engaging. He would open fire with all 8 guns, sustaining bursts lasting 3 to 5 seconds, while tracking the target through his computing gun sight. The volume of fire would systematically destroy the target through accumulated damage, shredding control surfaces, severing cables, puncturing fuel systems, and overwhelming structural integrity through sheer number of hits. On November 2, 1944, Preddy demonstrated this methodology with brutal efficiency during an engagement near Merseburg. His squadron encountered approximately 40 German fighters attempting to attack a bomber formation. Rather than engaging in traditional dogfighting, Preddy and his wingmen maintained altitude advantage and made repeated slashing attacks that utilized their superior long-range gunnery. Preddy destroyed 2 Messerschmitt Bf-109s on his first pass, both aircraft disintegrating under sustained .50 caliber fire at ranges exceeding 450 yards. He climbed back to altitude, repositioned, and made a second pass that destroyed another 109. By the engagement's end, Preddy had expended approximately 1,200 rounds and destroyed 3 German fighters without taking a single hit in return. His wingmen accounted for 4 additional kills using identical tactics. The German survivors filed combat reports describing the encounter in terms that revealed how completely American gunnery doctrine had shattered Luftwaffe tactical confidence. Lieutenant Hans Wake, flying with Jagdgeschwader 300, described watching his Staffel commander's aircraft explode under Mustang fire at what he estimated as over 500 meters range. I could not believe the Americans could hit at such distance, but I watched their tracers reach across the sky and tear Hauptmann Müller's aircraft apart. He didn't even have time to bail out. The aircraft simply came apart in the air. We tried to engage, to close to range where our cannon could be effective, but every time we maneuvered toward the Mustangs, they would turn away, maintaining distance, continuing to fire those terrible machine guns. 3 more aircraft from our Staffel were destroyed before we broke off the engagement. We didn't even fire our weapons. We were being killed before we could get close enough to shoot back. This tactical helplessness became increasingly common as German pilots learned, through bitter experience, that engaging Mustangs meant accepting losses they couldn't inflict in return. The Luftwaffe's emphasis on cannon firepower, once considered an overwhelming advantage, had become a liability. German pilots carried weapons effective only at ranges where American pilots could destroy them before they arrived. The tactical revolution was complete. Generalleutnant Adolf Galland, increasingly desperate to reverse the deteriorating situation, authorized tactical experiments that represented fundamental breaks with established doctrine. Fighter units received permission to avoid combat with American escorts entirely, focusing exclusively on bombers, even when doing so meant accepting heavy losses from unopposed Mustang attacks. The logic was brutal but inescapable. Destroying bombers was the mission's objective, and German fighters could no longer effectively contest American fighter superiority. The results of this policy shift demonstrated how completely the strategic situation had deteriorated. On November 26, 1944, over 400 German fighters attacked bomber formations near Berlin in one of the war's largest single-day aerial battles. The German pilots, following Galland's directives, ignored American escorts and pressed home attacks on the bombers with suicidal determination. They destroyed 11 B-17 flying fortresses and damaged dozens more, a tactical success by any measure. But American Mustang pilots, freed from defensive responsibilities, systematically destroyed the German attackers with devastating efficiency. By day's end, the Luftwaffe had lost 98 fighters destroyed and another 62 damaged beyond immediate repair. Over 70 German pilots were killed or missing. The exchange ratio, 11 bombers for 98 fighters, was strategically catastrophic. Germany could not sustain such losses while America replaced damaged bombers within days. The psychological impact on surviving German pilots reached crisis levels. Oberst Walter Dahl, commander of Jagdgeschwader 300, reported to Galland that pilot morale had collapsed to the point where missions were becoming operationally impossible. Pilots were claiming mechanical problems to avoid flying. Others were reporting stress-related medical symptoms that grounded them for weeks. The most experienced pilots were requesting transfers to other fronts, any theatre where they wouldn't face American Mustangs. Dahl's report, preserved in Luftwaffe archives, provides harrowing insight into the human cost of technological and tactical inferiority. My pilots are being slaughtered. They know they are being slaughtered. They watch their friends die in aircraft that cannot effectively fight back against American escorts. The Mustangs engage from beyond our cannon range. They fire continuously while we must conserve ammunition. Their bullets tear through our aircraft with systematic efficiency that our armor cannot stop. I have pilots with 50 missions who refuse to fly. I have Staffel commanders requesting transfer to night fighters, to ground attack, to any duty that doesn't require engaging American fighters. The men are not cowards. They are veterans who have faced death repeatedly, but they have lost all faith in our ability to win, or even to survive. The Americans have built a system we cannot defeat with courage or skill. The winter of 1944–45 brought the Luftwaffe's fighter force to the edge of complete operational collapse. Monthly losses exceeded 1,000 aircraft. Pilot casualties reached levels that made unit cohesion impossible to maintain. New pilots arrived at operational units with less than 100 hours of total flying time, compared to the 300 hours American pilots received before deployment. These inadequately trained aviators were thrown into combat against experienced American pilots flying superior aircraft, and they died in staggering numbers. The final major German fighter offensive occurred on January 1, 1945. Operation Bodenplatte, conceived as a desperate strike against Allied airfields in Belgium and Holland, committed over 800 fighters to coordinated attacks on Allied bases. The operation achieved tactical surprise, destroying or damaging approximately 300 Allied aircraft on the ground, primarily older types being phased out of service. But as Allied fighters scrambled and engaged the withdrawing German formations, the operation transformed into catastrophe. American Mustang pilots, many of whom had been on the ground when the attacks began, pursued the German fighters with systematic determination. The engagements that followed demonstrated with final clarity the complete superiority of American gunnery doctrine. Captain John Voll of the 352nd Fighter Group was eating breakfast when German fighters strafed his airfield at Perz, Asch, Belgium. He sprinted to his Mustang, started the engine while ground crew were still pulling wheel chocks, and took off directly into the retreating German formation. What followed was a masterclass in American fighter tactics applied under chaotic conditions. Vol selected a Focke-Wulf 190 flying at low altitude, attempting to escape at maximum speed. He established pursuit position approximately 500 yards astern, well beyond the range where the German pilot could effectively return fire even if he attempted a defensive reversal. Vol opened fire with all 8 guns, the computing gun sight automatically calculating lead for the crossing angle. The Focke-Wulf shuddered under hits almost immediately. Pieces of aluminum skin peeled away from the wings and fuselage. The canopy shattered. Smoke began streaming from the engine. The German pilot attempted evasive maneuvers, but Vol maintained firing position, sustaining his burst through the target's defensive turns. After approximately 5 seconds of continuous fire, enough critical systems had been destroyed that the Focke-Wulf rolled inverted and crashed into the frozen Belgian countryside. Vol climbed back to altitude, spotted another German fighter, and repeated the process. Then, a third. By the time he exhausted his ammunition and returned to base, he had destroyed 3 German fighters in less than 15 minutes of combat. He had expended approximately 1,800 rounds, 600 per kill, and had never closed to within 300 yards of his targets. The German pilots had died before they could effectively engage. Across Belgium and Holland, similar encounters repeated throughout the morning. American pilots who had been caught on the ground during the initial attacks took off and pursued the retreating Germans with predatory efficiency. By noon, the Luftwaffe had lost over 270 fighters destroyed, with another 140 damaged. German pilot casualties exceeded 180 killed or missing, including dozens of experienced unit commanders whose loss would prove irreplaceable. The Americans lost approximately 40 fighters in air-to-air combat, almost all during the initial confusion when German aircraft achieved surprise. Once organized pursuit began, the exchange ratio shifted decisively in favor of American pilots whose superior gunnery and aircraft performance created killing advantages that German tactical doctrine couldn't overcome. Operation Bodenplatte, conceived as a desperate gamble to regain air superiority, instead accelerated the Luftwaffe's collapse. Legacy. Acknowledgement from the defeated. The final months of the European war saw German fighter opposition dwindle to scattered resistance that could harass but not seriously threaten Allied air operations. The Luftwaffe's day fighter force, which had fielded over 2,000 aircraft in early 1944, could barely muster 400 operational fighters by April 1945. Pilot quality had deteriorated so severely that experienced American pilots reported encounters with German aviators who seemed barely capable of controlled flight, let alone aerial combat. But among the surviving German aces, the men who had lived through hundreds of missions and witnessed the systematic destruction of their service, a grudging respect for American capabilities emerged. This respect focused particularly on the P-51 Mustang and the gunnery doctrine that made it so devastatingly effective. In post-war interviews and memoirs, German fighter pilots who had survived the war provided testimony that validated everything American training and doctrine had attempted to achieve. Major Heinz Bahr, who survived the war as Germany's third highest-scoring ace, provided perhaps the most detailed analysis in his 1947 memoir, The Last Fighter Pilot. Bahr had flown combat on both the Eastern and Western fronts, giving him unique perspective on how Soviet and American opponents differed in tactical capability. The Russians were brave, even reckless, but their equipment and training were inferior to ours throughout most of the war. On the Eastern Front, if you achieved good firing position, you could destroy the target with confidence. The Western Allies were entirely different. The British Spitfire was an excellent aircraft, very maneuverable, but its armament was conventional. We understood how to fight it. The American Mustang was something else entirely. Its performance was good, but not exceptional by late-war standards. Our Focke-Wulf 190D and Messerschmitt 109K matched it in most categories. But the Mustang's armament and the American pilot's gunnery training created advantages we could not overcome. They would engage at ranges where our cannon were useless. They would fire continuously, walking their bullets into us with systematic precision. Their computing, gun sights made them deadly at distances we considered impossible. I was hit by Mustang fire on 3 separate occasions. Each time, the damage was extraordinary. Not single catastrophic hits like cannon shells would cause, but accumulated destruction from dozens of bullets striking across my aircraft. Control cables severed, fuel lines ruptured, engine components damaged, hydraulic systems destroyed. The cumulative effect was as deadly as any cannon, but it happened at ranges where we couldn't fight back. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, interviewed extensively by American intelligence officers after the war, provided institutional perspective on how the Luftwaffe's assessment of American fighters evolved through bitter experience. Galland had commanded German fighter forces during the period when Mustangs entered service and witnessed firsthand the tactical revolution they represented. We made a fundamental miscalculation about American fighter effectiveness. Our intelligence assessed the Mustang's machine gun armament as inferior to our cannon, which was true in terms of individual projectile power. But we failed to understand that the Americans had created a complete system of fire control, ammunition capacity, and pilot training that made their machine guns as effective as our cannon in practical combat conditions. Their computing gun sights allowed ordinary pilots to achieve gunnery accuracy that only our best pilots could match. Their ammunition capacity allowed sustained fire that overwhelmed targets through accumulated damage. Their training programs produced pilots who understood how to exploit these advantages systematically. By the time we recognized what we faced, it was too late to develop effective countermeasures. The Mustang didn't defeat us through superior performance. It defeated us through superior integration of technology, training, and tactical doctrine. The Americans built a system, not just an aircraft. That system proved devastatingly effective against our approach to fighter combat. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, who survived the war despite being severely burned in a crash during the final weeks, provided the most philosophically sophisticated analysis of why German fighter aviation failed against American opposition. His 1970 memoir, The Straits of Messina, contained extensive reflection on the technological and tactical lessons of the air war. We Germans approached fighter design as an engineering problem to be solved through technical excellence. We built aircraft with superior performance characteristics, armed them with devastating cannon, and trained pilots to exploit these advantages through tactical brilliance. This approach worked magnificently against opponents who fought similarly. The British flew technically excellent aircraft and fought with great courage, but within a tactical framework we understood. The Americans fought differently. They built systems rather than individual weapons. They accepted performance compromises in favor of reliability and ease of operation. They armed their fighters with weapons that seemed inferior by our standards but proved more effective in practice. Most importantly, they trained pilots in standardized procedures that amplified ordinary skill rather than requiring exceptional talent. The Mustang embodied this philosophy perfectly. It was a good aircraft, not a great one by pure performance metrics, but it was integrated into a complete system of computing gun sights, standardized tactics, and extensive training that made it devastating in combat. The Mustang's .850 caliber machine guns weren't individually more powerful than our cannon, but they could engage at longer range, fire longer bursts, and hit with greater accuracy because of superior fire control and pilot training. We lost the air war not because American aircraft were better, though by war's end they were competitive with anything we fielded. We lost because the Americans created a sustainable system that produced competent pilots in large numbers, equipped them with reliable aircraft optimized for their training level, and gave them technological aids that amplified their capabilities. Our system required exceptional pilots in exceptional aircraft. Their system made ordinary pilots deadly. Industrial warfare rewards the latter. The statistical record supports these qualitative assessments with brutal clarity. During 1944, the final full year of sustained air combat over Europe, American fighters destroyed approximately 4,700 German aircraft in air-to-air combat. The P-51 Mustang, despite representing only about 40% of American fighter strength for most of the year, accounted for approximately 63% of these victories, roughly 2,960 confirmed kills. The kill ratio favored American pilots decisively. Mustang losses in air-to-air combat averaged approximately 7 aircraft per 1,000 sorties. German fighter losses to Mustang pilots exceeded 20 aircraft per 1,000 American sorties. The mathematical implication was stark. In any engagement between comparable numbers of Mustangs and German fighters, German losses would be approximately 3 times higher than American casualties. These numbers don't reflect individual combats where tactical conditions might favor one side or the other, but sustained operational effectiveness across thousands of missions. The Mustang's combination of long-range, sustained firepower, and superior pilot training created systematic advantages that accumulated into overwhelming operational superiority. German pilots might win individual engagements through exceptional skill or favorable circumstances, but they lost the campaign through mathematical attrition they couldn't reverse. The human cost of this technical and tactical disparity appears most clearly in German pilot casualty statistics. During 1944, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 2,800 fighter pilots killed in action on the Western Front, with another 1,200 wounded seriously enough to require extended hospitalization. These casualties represented not just individuals, but institutional knowledge that couldn't be replaced. Many of the killed pilots were experienced veterans, men with dozens or hundreds of missions, whose combat effectiveness was irreplaceable. The Luftwaffe's training programs, degraded by fuel shortages and harassment from Allied air attacks, produced replacement pilots with minimal flight time, who survived measured in single-digit missions before being killed or captured. The systematic destruction of experienced German pilots, many falling to Mustang fire at ranges where they couldn't effectively respond, represented a death spiral from which the Luftwaffe never recovered. By contrast, American fighter pilot casualties remained sustainable throughout the campaign. The 8th Air Force lost approximately 500 fighter pilots killed in air-to-air combat during 1944, with another 300 wounded. These losses, while personally tragic for the individuals involved, represented percentages low enough that unit effectiveness remained high. Replacement pilots arrived with extensive training and transitioned into combat under conditions where numerical and technological superiority provided margins for error. The broader implications of American gunnery doctrine's success extended beyond the immediate tactical context of World War II. The principle that sustained accurate fire from multiple weapons could be more effective than single devastating strikes from heavier armament would influence fighter design for decades. The United States Air Force, analyzing combat data from both World War II and the Korean War, concluded that rapid-fire weapons with large ammunition capacity provided more consistent combat effectiveness than slower-firing cannon. This philosophy influenced American fighter armament through the 1950s and 60s. The F-86 Sabre, which dominated Korean War air combat, mounted 6 50 caliber machine guns, deliberately choosing proven reliability over the 20mm cannon that some designers advocated. The Phone 100 Super Sabre and Phone 04 Starfighter both carried 20mm cannon, but only after extensive development ensured reliability comparable to the proven 50 caliber. Even when American fighters transitioned to missiles as primary armament, the lessons of World War II gunnery doctrine remained influential. The principle that sustained engagement with high hit probability defeated brief encounters with devastating but inaccurate weapons, shaped missile tactics, and fire control development. The computing gunsight technology, pioneered in World War II, evolved into sophisticated radar fire control systems that made missile accuracy far higher than early weapon designs would have achieved through pilot skill alone. The German aces, who survived to see this technological evolution, recognized their own experiences reflected in post-war developments. In a 1961 reunion of former Luftwaffe and USAAF pilots in Colorado Springs, several surviving aces discussed how the Air War's lessons had shaped subsequent aviation development. Major Heinz, then serving as a test pilot for German industry, conversed with Colonel Hub Zemke, the former commander of the 56th Fighter Group, who had flown both P-47s and P-51s in combat. According to reunion transcripts preserved in Air Force historical archives, Barr acknowledged what many German pilots had been reluctant to admit during the war. "We believed our cannon armament made us superior. We trained to deliver single, devastating strikes. But you Americans built a system that made sustained, accurate fire more effective than our brief attacks. Your 50-caliber machine guns, your computing gun sights, your training methods, they created capabilities we couldn't match with heavier weapons and better individual aircraft performance." The Mustang was never the best fighter aerodynamically, but it was the best weapon system, and that distinction proved decisive. You didn't need the fastest aircraft or the most powerful guns. You needed a complete system that let competent pilots kill consistently. That's what the Mustang provided, and why we learned to fear it more than any other Allied fighter. Zemke's response captured the American perspective that had driven fighter development and training throughout the war. "We weren't trying to build the perfect aircraft. We were trying to build aircraft that could win a campaign." The Mustang's 850s weren't individually impressive, but together, controlled by a computing site and fired by a pilot trained to use them properly, they were devastating. We could engage at ranges where German cannon couldn't reach us. We could sustain fire through evasive maneuvers. We could destroy anything we hit, given enough time. The German aces were better pilots than most of us on an individual basis. But we didn't need to be as good individually, because our systems made us effective collectively. That was the real lesson of the air war. Superior individual capability matters less than superior systematic effectiveness in industrial warfare. This exchange, between former enemies who had spent years trying to kill each other, represented a mature understanding of what the air war had actually proven. The question had never been whether German or American fighters were individually superior, but which approach to aerial warfare would prove more effective in the specific strategic context of the bombing campaign. American doctrine, built around sustained, accurate fire from reliable weapons controlled by standardized training and technological aids, had proven devastatingly superior to German emphasis on individual tactical brilliance and heavy armament. Conclusion: the mathematics of survival. The final accounting of the P-51 Mustang's combat record provides quantitative validation of what German pilots learned qualitatively through bitter experience. Mustangs destroyed approximately 4,800 German aircraft in air-to-air combat during World War II, making them the highest-scoring American fighter type of the conflict. They achieved this total while suffering approximately 2,300 combat losses, producing a kill ratio of approximately 2-to-1, the highest sustained ratio of any mass-produced fighter in the European theatre. These numbers tell only part of the story. The Mustang's real achievement wasn't destroying German fighters, though it did so with devastating efficiency. Its achievement was making the strategic bombing campaign possible by providing escort coverage that neutralized German interceptor effectiveness. Before Mustangs entered service in numbers, German fighters could inflict losses on bomber formations that threatened campaign sustainability. After Mustangs achieved operational strength in spring 1944, German fighters could rarely attack bombers without being engaged by escorts that destroyed them systematically. The transformation in German pilot perceptions, from contemptuous dismissal of machine gun armament to fearful respect for systematic lethality, paralleled the Luftwaffe's declining operational effectiveness. By war's end, German fighter aviation had been reduced to scattered resistance that could harass but not prevent Allied air operations. The pilots who survived carried lifelong respect for the aircraft and weapons systems that had defeated them. Hauptmann Heinz Knoke, whose encounter with a Mustang near Brunswick had shattered his confidence in March 1944, survived the war with 52 victories. In his 1953 memoir, I Flew for the Führer, he provided final assessment of the aircraft that had changed his understanding of aerial combat. The Mustang was never the fastest fighter I faced. It wasn't the most maneuverable. It wasn't armed with the heaviest weapons. But it was the most deadly, because it combined adequate performance with superior weapons integration and pilot training. When I first encountered Mustangs, I dismissed them as weak because they carried machine guns instead of cannon. This was the mistake of a pilot trained in German doctrine where brief, devastating strikes were paramount. The Americans fought differently. They engaged at long range with sustained, accurate fire. Their .850 caliber guns created a wall of projectiles that destroyed everything they touched, given enough time, and they always had enough time, because they could engage before we could close to cannon range. By war's end, I feared Mustangs more than any other Allied fighter, not because they were technically superior to our best aircraft, but because the complete system, aircraft plus weapons plus fire control plus pilot training, proved devastatingly effective. The Americans had solved a different problem than we had. We built fighters to win dogfights through individual performance. They built fighters to win campaigns through systematic effectiveness. Their solution proved superior for the kind of war we actually fought. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.